The sun over the Persian plateau on the 15th of June in the year 1271 was not a star, it was a physical blow. A white, molten hammer that beat down upon the baked earth, shattering the air into shimmering, unbreathable waves. For Jamshid, a master builder from the city of Yazd, the heat was a living entity, a malevolent jinn that had to be outwitted, placated, and imprisoned. He stood on the half-finished rooftop of a wealthy merchant's new home, the clay tiles hot enough to cook bread, and looked out over the city. It was a sea of adobe, a sprawling organism of mud brick and straw that had learned to survive, even thrive, in this furnace. From this vantage point, the city's secret was visible. A forest of tall, silent towers that rose from the rooftops, the badgirs, the wind catchers. Jamshid was a man of 50, his skin the color and texture of old leather, his eyes narrowed to permanent slits against a lifetime of glare. He was not a nomad, but his ancestors had been, part of the great migrations of Persian peoples who had settled this arid land over 2 millennia before. The knowledge of the desert, of its rhythms and its cruelties, was in his blood. He understood, as his nomadic forefathers had, that survival here depended on a delicate dance with the elements. The desert gave 2 gifts, a relentless sun and a surprisingly cold night. The challenge was to use the cold of the night to defeat the heat of the day. His current project, commissioned in the spring of 1270, was a testament to this ancient art. The merchant, a man named Farhad, who had grown rich trading silk and spices along the routes opened by the Mongol Empire's Pax Mongolica, wanted a home that was a statement of wealth and comfort. But in Yazd, comfort was not measured in gold or jewels, but in degrees of coolness. Farhad wanted a sanctuary from the 45-degree-Celsius heat, a private oasis where he could forget the inferno outside. Down in the central courtyard, Jamshid's youngest apprentice, a boy of 15 named Kian, was struggling to move a large block of alabaster into the shade. Kian was new to the city, having arrived from a mountain village near Alamut in 1269, a refugee from the political turmoil that still echoed from the Mongol invasion of the 1250s. He was strong, but he did not yet understand the desert. He worked too hard in the midday sun, wasting his energy, fighting the heat instead of yielding to it. "Kian," Jamshid's voice was a sharp crack in the still air. "Leave the stone. Come up here." The boy obeyed, his face flushed, his tunic soaked with sweat. He climbed the ladder to the roof, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and respect for the master builder. Jamshid pointed to the largest of the wind catchers they were building, a magnificent octagonal tower that would be the centerpiece of the home's cooling system. "You see that?" he asked. "You think it is just a chimney in reverse. You are wrong. It is a trap. A trap for the wind, yes, but also a trap for the cold." He began to explain the principle, a lesson passed down through generations of builders since the first desert dwellers had sought shelter from the sun. He spoke of the 2 winds of Yazd, the pleasant, cool breeze that blew from the northeast and the hot, dusty wind from the southwest. The badgir was designed to catch the good wind and ignore the bad, but its true genius, he explained, was what it did when there was no wind at all. "Tonight," Jamshid said, "after the sun has set, the desert will give back all the heat it has stolen. The sand will grow cold. The air above it will cool and become heavy. This tower," he slapped the warm clay of the badgir, "will become a chimney. The last of the day's hot air inside the house will rise, drawn up and out through this shaft, and it will pull the cold night air down into the house to replace it. We do not just catch the wind, boy. We harvest the cold." This was the fundamental principle of desert architecture, a concept that had been refined since the first mud brick cities were built in Mesopotamia over 6,000 years ago. But in Persia, it had been elevated to an art form. Jamshid's design was a complex, integrated system. The cold air, harvested by the Badgir, would be channeled down into the Zirzamin, the deep basement, where it would pass over a pool of water fed by the Qanat. The Qanat, another marvel of Persian engineering developed around 800 BC, was a subterranean channel that brought cool, fresh water from the mountains miles away. The air, cooled further by the evaporation from the water, would then be drawn up into the main rooms of the house, creating a gentle, natural air conditioning. On the 20th of June, a caravan arrived from the south, bringing with it a visitor who would challenge Jamshid's ancient methods. He was an Arab scholar from Cairo named Ibn al-Masri, a man who had studied the great works of engineering in the Mamluk Sultanate, which had risen to power in 1250. He had heard of the famous wind catchers of Yazd and had come to see them for himself. He was a guest of Farhad, the merchant, and he was full of the confidence of a man from a great center of learning. Ibn al-Masri toured the construction site on the 21st of June, his face a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He was impressed by the scale of the Badgir, but he questioned its efficiency. "In Egypt," he announced, his voice echoing in the half-finished courtyard, "we have the mulkaf. It is a simpler, more direct system. A large opening high on the wall, facing the prevailing wind. It scoops the air and forces it down. It is a more powerful, more immediate cooling. This seems a very passive, very gentle system." He spoke of the grand buildings of Cairo, like the madrasa of Sultan Qalawun, completed in 1285, which used these powerful wind scoops. Jamshid, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "Your mulkaf is a fine thing for a land with a constant, predictable wind," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "It is a hunter. It shoots one arrow in one direction. Our Badgir is a farmer. It is patient. It works with what the desert gives it. It works with the wind, but it also works with the stillness. It works with the sun, and it works with the night. It does not just cool the air. It stores the cold." Ibn al-Masri was unconvinced. "Stored cold is a poet's fancy," he scoffed. "I believe in the power of moving air. I have proposed a new design for a hospital in Cairo, a bimaristan to be built in 1290, that will use a series of large, powerful mulkaf to keep the air fresh and cool for the sick. We will see which philosophy proves superior." That night, the 22nd of June, the desert provided its own answer. The wind died completely. The air became heavy, stagnant, and suffocating. In a house cooled by a mulkaf, the stillness would have been unbearable. But in the older, completed homes of Yazd, the Badgirs began their silent, nightly work. The hot air from within the houses rose, and the cold, heavy air from the cooling desert floor was drawn down the shafts, a slow, imperceptible river of coolness that filled the rooms and offered relief from the oppressive heat. But a new, more immediate crisis was brewing. On the 25th of June, a sandstorm, a shamal, began to blow from the southwest. It was the bad wind, the one the Badgirs were designed to ignore. But this was no ordinary storm. It was a storm of unusual ferocity, a churning wall of sand and dust that blotted out the sun and turned the day to a hellish orange twilight. The fine, abrasive sand found its way into everything, and the multi-directional design of Jamshid's grand Badgir, not yet fully sealed and plastered, was vulnerable. The storm threatened to turn his sophisticated cooling system into a giant funnel for dust and sand, choking the house and ruining the delicate Qanat pool below. The scholar's words about the simpler, directional mulkaf echoed in Jamshid's mind. Had his complex design, in its attempt to be everything, created a fatal flaw? The storm was growing stronger, and the answer would come sooner than he thought. Part 2. The chamal was a physical assault. On the 26th of June, the wind howled like a legion of tormented spirits, and the air was so thick with sand that it was impossible to see the other side of the courtyard. Jamshid's magnificent octagonal badgir, with its 8 open mouths, had become a liability. Instead of catching the cool, clean air from the north, it was now inhaling the hot, dusty gale from the southwest, threatening to fill the house with a suffocating blanket of sand. The very feature that made it so effective in variable winds, its multi-directional design, was now its greatest weakness. Work on the house had come to a complete standstill. The apprentices, including Kian, huddled in the most sheltered corner of the unfinished structure, their faces wrapped in damp cloths to filter the air. Ibn al-Masri, the Cairene scholar, looked on with a grim, almost triumphant expression. "Your patient farmer has harvested a crop of dust," he remarked to Farhad, the merchant, on the 27th of June. "Perhaps a simple hunter, who knows which prey to target and which to ignore, is the wiser choice in such a land." Jamshid ignored the scholar's jibe. He was not a man given to panic. He had faced sandstorms before, though rarely one of this intensity. The problem was not the design itself, but its unfinished state. The final layers of plaster and the intricate wooden dampers that would allow him to close off specific vents had not yet been installed. The badgir was a lung without a larynx, unable to control its own breathing. He had to find a way to temporarily seal the windward vents without destroying the delicate internal structure. On the morning of the 28th of June, an idea came to him, inspired by the nomadic traditions that were the bedrock of his craft. He remembered the stories of his grandfather, who had traveled with the Bakhtiari tribes in the Zagros Mountains, and how they used heavy, felted wool rugs soaked in water to seal their tents against the wind and dust. The wet wool would swell, creating a near-perfect seal, and the evaporating water would provide an additional cooling effect. It was a simple, elegant solution born of necessity. He gathered Kian and 2 of his most trusted senior apprentices. "We are going to give the tower a throat," he announced. He instructed them to gather the heavy canvas cloths used to cover the building materials and several large goat hair blankets from the caravan supplies stored in the merchant's warehouse, a practice common since the Sasanian Empire's trade boom in the 6th century A.D. They hauled the heavy fabrics to the rooftop, a perilous journey in the howling wind. The air was a maelstrom of sand, and each breath was a struggle. Working on the rooftop was like working in the heart of a hurricane. The wind threatened to tear them from their footing. Jamshid, with the experience of a lifetime, directed the operation with hand signals, his voice lost in the roar. They soaked the heavy cloths and blankets in water from the cistern, making them almost too heavy to lift. Then, with a system of ropes and pulleys, they began the painstaking process of hoisting the wet, heavy fabrics up the side of the badgir and stuffing them into the 4 windward-facing vents, the ones inhaling the full fury of the chamal. It was brutal, exhausting work. The wet fabric was slippery and unwieldy. The wind fought them at every turn, whipping the heavy cloths like angry sails. Kian, despite his youth, proved his worth. His mountain-bred strength and surprising agility made him invaluable on the treacherous rooftop. He scrambled up the scaffolding, securing the ropes, his initial fear replaced by a focused determination. He was beginning to understand the master's way, not to fight the storm, but to use its own force to wedge the seals into place. By the time the pale, dust-choked sun began to set on the 29th of June, they had managed to seal the 4 most vulnerable vents. The effect was immediate. The torrent of dust pouring into the house slowed to a trickle. The howling of the wind in the tower was muffled to a low moan. They had not defeated the storm, but they had tamed it. They had taught the Badgir to hold its breath. That evening, as the exhausted builders rested, Ibn al-Masri inspected their handiwork. He was silent for a long time, his face a mask of contemplation. "A crude solution," he said finally, "but an effective one. You have turned your great tower into a simple, one-sided mulkaf." "I have reminded it of its ancestors," Jamshid replied quietly. "The first wind catchers, like those in the ruins of the fire temples from 4000 BC, were likely simple, single-vent structures. Complexity is a luxury, not a necessity. The wise builder knows when to be simple." The storm raged for 2 more days. On the 1st of July, the wind finally began to subside. By the morning of the 2nd of July, the Shamal had passed, leaving behind a world coated in a fine layer of yellow dust. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, and the silence was as profound as the storm's roar had been. Jamshid and his team removed the temporary seals. The interior of the Badgir was coated in a thick layer of sand, which they painstakingly cleaned out over the next week. The crisis had passed, but it had taught Jamshid a valuable lesson. He decided to modify the design. On the 10th of July, he began personally carving a series of intricate wooden dampers, based on designs he had seen in Isfahan, a city renowned for its craftsmanship since the Seljuk dynasty made it their capital in the 11th century. These dampers, fitted into each of the 8 vents, could be opened and closed from below using a system of ropes and levers. It was a significant addition, adding a new layer of control and adaptability to the system. The Badgir would now be able to choose which winds to breathe, a fully articulated lung for the house. By the 15th of August, the house was nearing completion. The Badgir was fully plastered, its white surface gleaming in the sun. The dampers were installed and working perfectly. The Qanat-fed pool in the basement was full of cool, clear water. The house was ready for its first true test. The hottest part of the summer, the demon 40 days, known as the Chilla, was upon them. On the 20th of August, the temperature outside soared to 48 degrees Celsius. The city shimmered in the heat, the air thick and stagnant. Farhad, the merchant, and his family moved into the house, along with their guest, Ibn al-Masri. They gathered in the main hall, a large, airy room directly above the zirzamin. The windows were shuttered against the sun. The only light came from the intricate plaster latticework high on the walls, and the air. The air was cool. It was not the aggressive artificial cold of a mountain cave, but a gentle living coolness that seemed to rise from the very floors. There was a faint, pleasant scent of damp earth and stone. The temperature in the room was a full 15 degrees cooler than the inferno outside. Ibn al-Masri walked to the center of the room and held up a hand. He could feel the faint, almost imperceptible movement of the air as it rose from the vents in the floor. He looked up at the ceiling, as if he could see the entire system at work. The great tower inhaling the cool night air, the air falling to the basement, kissing the surface of the Qanat water, and then rising, refreshed and rejuvenated, to breathe life into the house. He had witnessed a miracle of engineering, a perfect marriage of design and nature. "You do not store the cold, Jamshid," the scholar said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "You give it a home. You build it a sanctuary, and you invite it to stay. It is not a poet's fancy. It is the highest form of science." But as the family celebrated their new, cool sanctuary, a new danger was gathering, one that no Badgir could defend against. A messenger arrived on the 25th of August, his horse lathered in sweat, his face grim. He brought news from the east, from the city of Herat, which had been rebuilt after its destruction by the Mongols in 1221. A sickness was spreading along the caravan routes, a fever, a cough, and a swift, merciless death. They called it the wind of poison. It traveled with the merchants and the pilgrims, and it was moving west. It was moving towards Yazd. The house could protect them from the heat, but it was designed to breathe, and now the very air itself threatened to become the enemy. The perfect cooling system, a marvel of open, flowing air, was about to become a trap of a very different kind. The greatest test was yet to come. Part 3. The news of the wind of poison fell upon the cool, tranquil atmosphere of the merchant's house like a shroud. The date was the 26th of August, 1271. The plague, a recurring nightmare that had haunted the cities of the Silk Road for centuries, was a far more terrifying enemy than the sun. The Black Death was still a century in the future, but smaller, yet still devastating. Epidemics were a constant feature of life. This particular outbreak, likely a form of pneumonic plague, was said to have originated in the Mongol heartland and had flared up in the summer of 1270. Now it was at their doorstep. Yazd, a hub of commerce and travel, was particularly vulnerable. By the 1st of September, the first cases appeared in the city's crowded caravanserai, the roadside inns that had been a feature of Persian travel since the Achaemenid Empire established the Royal Road in the 5th century BC. The city's governor, a man appointed by the ruling Ilkhanate, the Mongol dynasty in Persia, ordered a quarantine on the 3rd of September. The city gates were closed. No one was allowed in or out. Yazd had become a beautiful, sun-drenched prison. Farhad's new home, once a symbol of openness and connection to the elements, now felt like a trap. The very system that made it a paradise of cool air was predicated on drawing the outside world in. The Badgir, the house's great lung, was now a potential vector for disease, inhaling the same air that carried the whispers of the plague. Fear, a more suffocating presence than any summer heat, began to permeate the cool, spacious rooms. On the 5th of September, Farhad summoned Jamshid and Ibn al-Masri to the main hall. The merchant, a man accustomed to controlling his own destiny, was now powerless, his wealth useless against an invisible enemy. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice strained. "Do we seal the house? Do we block the wind-catcher? If we do, we will be trading the plague for a furnace. We will suffocate in our own heat." Ibn al-Masri, the scholar, was the first to speak. His scientific mind, trained in the medical traditions of Avicenna, whose canon of medicine from the 11th century was the standard medical text, immediately saw the danger. "The miasma, the bad air, is what carries the sickness," he argued, reflecting the prevailing medical theory of the time. "We must stop the flow of air from the city. We must seal the Badgir completely. We can survive the heat. We cannot survive the poison wind." Jamshid listened, his face a stony mask. He understood the scholar's logic. It was the logic of fear, the logic of retreat. But his builder's intuition, his deep, almost mystical understanding of the house as a living system, told him that this was the wrong path. "If we seal the house," he countered, his voice low and steady, "we will create a different kind of sickness. The air will become stagnant. The dampness from the Qanat will breed mold and foulness. We will be living in a sealed tomb, breathing our own exhalations. The house must breathe, or it will die, and we will die with it." The debate raged for 2 days. On the 7th of September, the city's death toll began to rise. The haunting sound of funeral prayers became a constant, mournful backdrop to their lives. Farhad, caught between the scholar's science and the builder's intuition, was paralyzed with indecision. The household staff were terrified. Kian, the young apprentice who had remained with his master, watched Jamshid, his faith in the old builder unwavering. Jamshid spent those 2 days in quiet observation. He did not argue. He watched. He felt the air. He went to the roof and studied the sky. He descended to the sardab, the deep cellar, and listened to the gurgle of the qanat. He was not just a builder, he was the house's physician, and he was diagnosing his patient. The problem was not the air itself, he reasoned, but what the air carried. The solution was not to stop the breathing, but to purify the breath. On the evening of the 8th of September, he came to Farhad with a plan. It was a plan that was both radical and deeply traditional, drawing on the ancient Persian knowledge of herbs and the purifying properties of fire and smoke, a knowledge that dated back to the Zoroastrian rituals of the Sasanian period. "We will not seal the lung," he announced. "We will teach it to clean the air it breathes." His plan had 3 parts. The first was to harness the power of evaporative cooling in a new way. He proposed hanging heavy woolen cloths, similar to the ones they had used against the sandstorm, in the main shaft of the badgir. But this time, the cloths would be kept constantly soaked in a solution of water, vinegar, and rosewater. Vinegar, used as a disinfectant since the time of the ancient Babylonians around 3000 BC, was believed to neutralize miasmas. The rosewater, a famed product of Persia, would help to calm the nerves and purify the spirit. The evaporation, he argued, would not only cool the air, but also wash it, trapping dust and, hopefully, the invisible particles of the plague. The second part of the plan was to use smoke. Below the main shaft of the badgir in the Zirzaman, he proposed keeping a small, constantly smoldering fire in a brazier. The fire would not be of wood, but of a specific mixture of herbs: wild rue, esfand, frankincense, and sandalwood. The practice of burning esfand to ward off the evil eye and purify spaces was an ancient one in Persia, documented as far back as the Achaemenid period. The aromatic resins, Jamshid believed, would fumigate the air as it was drawn up from the basement, killing the poison it contained. The final part of the plan was the most audacious. He proposed to alter the very heart of the system, the qanat pool. He wanted to partially divert the flow of the qanat so that a thin film of water would constantly flow over the heated stones of the bathhouse furnace, which had been built in 1268, before being channeled into the cooling pool. This would create a steady, gentle stream of steam, infusing the air with a clean, warm moisture that was believed to be anathema to the cold, dry poison of the plague. Ibn al-Masri was aghast. "Madness," he declared on the 9th of September. "You will create a hot, steamy, smoky, perfumed swamp. You will turn a marvel of engineering into an alchemist's fever dream." The principles of Galen, established in the 2nd century AD, are clear. Sickness comes from an imbalance of the humors. We need cool, dry air to balance the hot, moist humors of the fever, not this witch's brew. But Farhad, seeing the death toll in the city mount, was desperate. Jamshid's plan, while unorthodox, was a plan of action. The scholar's plan was one of passive surrender. "Do it," the merchant said, his voice firm. "Do whatever you must." The house was transformed into a laboratory. On the 10th of September, Jamshid and Kian ascended to the roof and hung the vinegar-soaked cloths in the great tower. In the basement, they lit the brazier of sacred herbs, and a fragrant, cleansing smoke began to rise. Jamshid, with his intimate knowledge of the house's plumbing, worked for a full day on the 11th of September to divert the qanat flow over the furnace stones. By the evening of the 12th of September, the system was active. The atmosphere inside the house changed completely. The air was still cool, but it was a different kind of coolness. It was soft, humid, and fragrant with the scent of herbs and roses. The sharp, dry edge of the desert air was gone, replaced by a gentle, almost tropical humidity. It was like living inside a giant, breathing garden. For a week they lived in their fragrant sanctuary. The death toll outside continued to rise. The city was gripped by panic. But inside the walls of Farhad's home there was a strange, almost surreal sense of peace. The family and staff remained healthy. Ibn al-Masri, though still skeptical, had to admit that the air felt pleasant and clean, and his own nagging cough, brought on by the dust of his journey, had subsided. The true test came on the 20th of September. One of the household servants, a young woman who had been secretly meeting her family at the city wall, fell ill. She developed a high fever and a racking cough. The plague had breached their defenses. Panic erupted. The other servants wanted to cast the sick woman out. Farhad, in his fear, was inclined to agree. It was Jamshid who intervened. "No," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that no one dared to question. "We do not cast out our own. The house will protect us." He had the sick servant moved to a small, isolated room in the summer section of the house, a room with its own small, dedicated air vent connected to the main Badgear system. He personally tended to her, bringing her water and food, and ensuring that a brazier of esfand burned constantly outside her door. He was putting his life, and the lives of everyone in the house, on the line, a direct test of his theory against the deadly reality of the plague. For 5 days, the household held its breath. The servants' fever raged, but no one else fell ill. Then, on the 25th of September, the crisis passed. The servant's fever broke. Her cough subsided. She was weak, but she would live, and she was the only one who had been afflicted. Jamshid's system had worked. It had not been a single element, but the combination of all three: the washed air from the tower, the fumigated air from the basement, and the humidified air from the modified Khanat. He had created a micro-environment that was hostile to the plague. He had used his knowledge of the elements not just to cool, but to heal. He had turned the house from a passive cooling machine into an active immunological system. Ibn al-Masri, humbled and awestruck, came to Jamshid on the 26th of September. "I came here as a scholar to observe," he said, "but I have become a student. You have shown me a science that is not written in our books. It is a science written in stone, water, and wind. It is the science of life." But as they celebrated their victory over the plague, a new threat was emerging from within their own walls. The constant humidity, the very thing that had helped to save them, was having an unforeseen effect on the structure of the house. The adobe bricks, the ancient building blocks of the desert, were designed for a dry climate. They could absorb heat, but they could not endure constant dampness. In the deep, humid warmth of the Zirzamin, the foundation bricks, a batch made in the unusually wet spring of 1269, were beginning to soften. A small, almost invisible crack had appeared at the base of the main structural wall that supported the Great Badgear. The house had saved them from the plague, but now it was beginning to consume itself from within. The greatest test of Jamshid's skill was not over. It had just taken on a new, more insidious form. The house was sick, and its heart was about to fail. Part 4. The plague in Yazd peaked in the first week of October 1271 and began to recede as the weather grew cooler. By the 20th of October, the city gates were reopened, and life, scarred and diminished, began to return to a semblance of normality. But within the walls of Farhad's magnificent home, a new silent crisis was unfolding. The victory over the sickness had come at a cost, and the bill was coming due. Jamshid first noticed the problem on the 22nd of October. It was a subtle change, something only a man who knew the house as intimately as his own body would perceive. A slight warping in a wooden door frame near the entrance to the Zirzamin. A faint, musty smell in the air that was different from the clean scent of damp earth he had cultivated. He ran his hand along the base of the main wall in the basement, the massive wall that bore the weight of the central structure and the great badgear above. The plaster felt cool and slightly soft to the touch. He chipped a small piece away. The adobe brick beneath was damp, almost spongy. His heart went cold. The constant humidity from his plague prevention system, a system that had run for nearly 2 months, had saturated the foundations. Adobe, a sun-baked mixture of clay, sand, and straw, was a miraculous building material, a technology used in the region since the time of the ancient city of Susa around 4395 BC. It had immense thermal mass and was perfectly suited to the arid climate. But its one great enemy was water. The bricks, designed to bake and harden in the dry desert air, were now slowly, silently, reverting to their original state. Mud. On the 25th of October, he showed his discovery to Kian. He pointed to a hairline crack, no wider than a thread, that ran from the floor up the wall for about a foot. "The house has a fever," he said, his voice grim. "We have saved the body, but the bones are rotting." Kian, who now saw the house as a living being, was horrified. "Can we not just let it dry?" he asked. "The plague is gone. We can stop the steam and the wet cloths." "It is not that simple," Jamshid explained. "The moisture is deep in the bricks, and the weight of the tower is immense. If the foundation fails, the entire central structure will collapse. The badgear will come down through the roof. The house will kill itself." They were faced with an engineering nightmare. They could not simply replace the damaged bricks. They were at the very bottom of the main structural wall. To get to them, they would have to somehow support the immense weight of the structure above. It was a problem that would have challenged the greatest cathedral builders of Europe, who had been developing techniques of structural support like flying buttresses since the 12th century. Here, in the desert, with only traditional materials, it seemed impossible. For a week, Jamshid barely ate or slept. He spent his days and nights in the basement, studying the wall, tapping it, listening to it, as if he could hear the slow, molecular decay happening within. He consulted ancient texts on building, scrolls that detailed the construction techniques of the Sasanian palaces at Ctesiphon from the 3rd century AD, but found no solution. The ancients had built with stone and fired brick in their grandest structures. They had not faced the problem of a saturated adobe foundation on this scale. By the 1st of November, the crack had widened. It was now visible to anyone who looked. Farhad, the merchant, was frantic. His sanctuary, his fortress against the desert, was threatening to crumble. "Do something, Jamshid," he pleaded. "You are the master builder. You saved us from the plague. Can you not save us from a little dampness?" It was in that moment of despair, on the 2nd of November, that the solution came to Jamshid. It came not from the grand traditions of imperial architecture, but from the humble, practical ingenuity of the desert nomads. He remembered watching a group of Tuareg nomads, the blue men of the Sahara, repairing a well in a remote oasis during his travels as a young man in the 1240s. The well wall had partially collapsed, and they had no way to shore it up from the inside. Instead, they had used a system of external pressure, packing wet sand and clay against the outside of the wall and letting the sun bake it into a hard, supportive shell. They had healed the wall from the outside in. Jamshid realized he could do the same. He would not try to replace the weak foundation. He would build a new one around it. He would encase the entire base of the weakened wall in a massive, rock-hard shell of a material specifically designed to counteract the dampness. He gathered his team on the 3rd of November and laid out his audacious plan. They would build a buttress, a second skin for the wall, but not of adobe. They would use sarouj, a traditional Iranian mortar that was waterproof and almost as hard as stone. Sarouj was a complex mixture of clay, lime, and ash, with egg whites and goat hair sometimes added for extra strength. Its use was ancient, dating back to the Elamite period in the 3rd millennium BC, and it was the secret behind the durability of the water cisterns and ice houses, yakchals, of the desert. First, they had to dry the existing wall as much as possible. They returned to the principle of the badgir, but in reverse. They sealed off the basement and, on the 5th of November, brought in dozens of braziers filled with burning charcoal. They turned the zirzamin into a furnace, the intense, dry heat baking the walls for 3 straight days. The air became thick and hot, but it was a dry, cleansing heat that drew the moisture out of the suffering adobe. While the basement baked, Kian and the other apprentices were put to work preparing the sarouj. It was a laborious, ritualistic process. They mixed the fine clay and lime in a large pit, then added the ash from the bathhouse furnace. They spent a full day, on the 7th of November, treading the mixture with their bare feet, a traditional method to ensure a perfect, even consistency. On the 9th of November, the true work began. The basement had cooled, and the walls were dry to the touch, though Jamshid knew the core was still damp. They built a wooden framework around the base of the weakened wall, leaving a gap of about 2 feet. Then they began to apply the sarouj. It was not like laying bricks. It was like sculpting. They packed the thick, sticky mortar into the gap, layer by painstaking layer, tamping it down, forcing it into every crack and crevice. It was a slow, grueling process that took another 4 days. By the 13th of November, they had built a massive sloping buttress, a new foundation that encased the old one, hugging it like a protective shell. Now they had to wait. The sarouj needed to cure, a slow chemical process that would turn it from a stiff clay into a waterproof, rock-hard mass. This was the most nerve-wracking part. During this time, the structure was at its most vulnerable. The new buttress was not yet strong enough to bear the full load if the old foundation decided to give way. On the night of the 15th of November, the crisis hit. A low groaning sound echoed from the basement. A new crack, wider and more menacing, appeared in the wall above the new buttress. The house was settling, the weakened adobe compressing under the immense weight. A shower of dust and plaster fell from the ceiling in the main hall. The family, woken by the noise, cried out in terror. Everyone rushed to evacuate, but Jamshid stood his ground in the center of the hall, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his hand held up for silence. He was listening. He was listening to the voice of the house. He could hear the groans and creaks of a structure in torment, but he could also hear something else, a new stability. The settling was slowing. The groans were becoming less frequent. He held up a hand to Farhad. "Wait," he commanded. "Listen." Slowly, the terrified household fell silent, and they heard it too. The house was still groaning, but the sounds were different now. They were not the sharp cracks of failure, but the low moans of a body shifting to a new position of strength. The sarouj was holding. The new foundation was taking the load. Jamshid descended into the basement, Kian and Ibn al-Masri at his heels. The new crack was there, a jagged wound in the wall. But below it, the sarouj buttress was solid, unblemished. It had not moved. It had not cracked. It had accepted the weight of the house and was holding it firm. He placed his hand on the new foundation. It was cool, solid, and strong. It felt like the bedrock of the mountains. They had done it. They had saved the house from itself. they had used the most ancient knowledge to solve the most immediate crisis. Jamshid had looked into the heart of the problem and had not seen a failure of materials, but a failure of balance. He had restored that balance, not by replacing the weakness, but by adding a new strength. He had healed the house from the outside in, just as the Nomads had healed the well. As the first light of dawn broke on the 16th of November, Jamshid stood in the courtyard, looking up at the great Badgir, which stood tall and proud against the morning sky. He had built it, he had defended it, and he had saved it. His creation was complete. It was more than a house. It was a living, breathing testament to 1,000 years of desert wisdom, a symphony of earth, wind, and water. The crisis was over, and the house and its builder had emerged stronger and wiser. The legacy of this extraordinary creation, however, was just beginning to unfold. Part 5. The years that followed the crises of 1271 were ones of quiet consolidation, both for the city of Yazd and for Jamshid's reputation. The merchant Farhad's house became a landmark, a place of pilgrimage for architects and scholars from across the Ilkhanate and beyond. Its fame spread along the Silk Road, a testament to a level of climate control and resilience that seemed almost magical. The story of its survival through sandstorm, plague, and structural failure became a local legend, a story that intertwined the genius of its builder with the ancient wisdom of the desert. Ibn al-Masri, the Cairene scholar, stayed in Yazd for another year until the autumn of 1272, documenting every aspect of the house's design and function. He filled volumes with detailed drawings of the Badgir's dampers, the Qanat's integration, and the composition of the Saruj mortar. His initial skepticism had transformed into a profound, scholarly admiration. When he finally returned to Cairo in 1273, he took with him not just the plans for a building, but a new philosophy of architecture. He incorporated Jamshid's principles into his design for the great Mansouri Bimaristan hospital built in Cairo, a project initiated in 1284. While the Egyptian designs retained the powerful mulkoff for direct ventilation, they were now augmented with internal courtyards, subterranean channels, and the use of thermal mass in a way that was distinctly Persian. The student had honored the master. Jamshid himself became the most sought-after builder in central Persia. He was commissioned by the Ilkhanate governor in 1275 to design a new palace in the cooler hills outside the city, and in 1280 he was asked to oversee the restoration of the city's Jame Mosque, a project that had been ongoing since the 12th century. In all his work, he applied the lessons he had learned from Farhad's house. He built with an awareness of the building as a living, breathing system, a delicate balance of forces and elements. His apprentices, led by the now accomplished Kian, spread his techniques throughout the region, creating a distinct Yazdi school of architecture that would influence Persian design for the next 2 centuries. The house itself became a living laboratory. Jamshid and Kian conducted experiments, refining the system over the years. In 1278, they experimented with different herbal mixtures for the fumigation brazier, discovering that the smoke from dried pomegranate peel was particularly effective at repelling insects. In 1282, they designed a system of adjustable shades for the courtyard, allowing them to control the amount of direct sunlight hitting the ground, further optimizing the thermal balance. Each modification was a small, incremental improvement on a system that was already near perfect. The legacy of Jamshid's creation and the tradition it represented has echoed through the centuries. The wind catchers of Yazd and of other desert cities in Iran continued to be a primary method of cooling until the advent of mechanical air conditioning in the mid-20th century. The Shah of Iran, in his drive for modernization in the 1960s, saw them as symbols of a backward past, and many were torn down. But with the global energy crisis of the 1970s, a new generation of architects and engineers began to look back at these ancient technologies with renewed interest. In the 1970s and 1980s, architects like Hassan Fathi in Egypt began to champion a return to traditional, sustainable building methods. His book, Architecture for the Poor, published in 1973, celebrated the genius of vernacular designs like the mulkaf and the adobe brick. In Iran, the 1979 revolution brought a renewed sense of national pride, and with it, a desire to preserve the country's unique cultural and architectural heritage. The old city of Yazd, with its forest of badgirs, was recognized as a national treasure, a process that culminated in its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017. Today, the principles embodied in Jamshid's house are at the forefront of sustainable design. The concept of passive cooling, once a necessity for survival, is now a sophisticated science. Architects use computational fluid dynamics to model the airflow in buildings, creating designs that are strikingly similar to the ancient badgirs. The use of thermal mass, green roofs, and natural ventilation are all key strategies in the fight against climate change. The idea of a building as an integrated, responsive system, a machine for living that works with nature rather than against it, is the central tenet of modern green architecture. In a museum in Tehran, a small faded scroll from the late 13th century is on display. It is a page from the notebooks of Ibn al-Masri, written upon his return to Cairo. On it is a detailed, intricate drawing of the octagonal badgir of Farhad's house. Beside it, in elegant Arabic script, is a note. "They do not build houses of mud and straw," it reads. "They build instruments for playing the music of the wind." Jamshid lived to a great age, passing away peacefully in the winter of 1295. He was buried in the courtyard of the Jame Mosque he had helped to restore. Kian, his successor, continued his work, training a new generation of builders in the science and art of desert architecture. The house of the merchant Farhad still stands in Yazd, a testament to their genius. It has survived the fall of dynasties, the passing of centuries, and the relentless assault of the desert sun. It stands as a silent, elegant reminder that the most sophisticated technology is often the one that is most in tune with the ancient rhythms of the natural world. It is a house that breathes, a house that heals, a house that remembers the fundamental truth that the desert nomads always knew. The key to survival is not to conquer the elements, but to find the harmony within them. The cold of the night, they knew, was not the enemy of the day, but its partner, its balance, its salvation. And in the heart of the desert, they built a home for the cold, and in doing so, they created a timeless paradise.